Welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club interview series. I'm Greg Larson, author of Clubbie, and today I am joined by the author of Unwritten Rules, a gay sports romance from Carina Press, a Harlequin imprint, Katie Casey. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, it's really awesome to be here to talk with you.
Of course, thank you so much. So when you first introduced me to your book, one of the first descriptors you gave me was that it has high heat levels, and you weren't kidding. I mean, we have a secret locker room love. We have bathroom sex scenes. We have locker room sex scenes. For the uninitiated, just give us a breakdown of what this book is.
Okay. There's also like plot, I guess.
Of course.
This is as Greg said, the book is called Unwritten Rules. Its working title was Pitch Framing and Other Lies until my my agent gently suggested that maybe that wasn't the most accessible title. And it is about a fictional baseball league, and is about a player named Zach Glasser, who the book is set in two timelines. In sort of the first timeline, he is a catcher for the Oakland Elephants baseball organization. He reports to spring training, and he meets Eugenio Morales, who is a rookie who's just been called up. He's kind of an older rookie, and the two meet and fall in love. And you then sort of fast forward / intercut to 3 years later, where they've gotten together and then they've broken up. And so it also focuses on what happens when they reunite at the, and I'm putting this in air quotes, All-Star Classic, because I cannot use any real copyrighted terms. So there's a lot of filing some serial numbers off. But it's about what happens when they come back together. And as Greg said, it's a romance. One of the requirements for romance is it has to have a happily ever after. So I'm going to spoil the end of the book. They get together and stay together.
So that's the thing. Okay, two things in there. One, so much of their courtship process is centered around the pitch framing training, where Zach is training. How do you pronounce his name? Eugenio?
Yeah, so it's like Eugenio Suarez.
Eugenio.
No, close enough. Eugenio.
Eugenio.
Yeah, there you go. So,
okay, so Zach is coaching Eugenio into being a better pitch framer. Why did you make that choice as the basis of their courtship process?
So, you know, the book, sort of as I conceived it, was about sort of things not being quite sort of what they appeared to be initially, which is, you know, sort of the soul of pitch framing. I really, you know, I'm a big baseball fan, obviously. I really love anything relating to pitching or pitch mechanics or whatever, and also got more and more interested in catching as a result of, honestly, an interest in pitching. And so it's one of those kind of baseball-y skills that lends itself to like some nice metaphorical constructions, but it's also a skill that like varies so highly among catchers. So it was really like, what happens when like a Mathis type catcher and a Wilson Contreras type catcher like have to learn from one another. Yeah, so that's sort of where it was, but it was also for the metaphorical reasons of, you know, things being somewhat deceptive is maybe not the right word, but just not appearing what they are at first glance.
Yeah, it's like the epigraph at the beginning. You talk about baseball being a game where every once in a while the catcher will step in and move a chess piece.
So you're referring to, I have a quote from Ben Lindbergh as the epigraph. Ben was gracious enough to let me use that quote. I think that was probably a first for him, where I was like, the book's pretty spicy. But like, there's this 2013 article from Grantland that really like sums up like the themes of the book. He's just like, all right. He's like, I never really considered the erotic potential of that, but sure, go ahead. So yeah, that's sort of the idea of I guess, some of the major themes in the book of, you
Mhm.
know, you have assumptions about how things work, but then you can have sort of people who are responsible for kind of reshaping their own destiny sounds a little like
Yeah, I get it.
highfalutin, but people have more control over the sort of processes on and off the diamond than they think they do it initially. Maybe that's
Right.
what I'll put.
And as perfectly illustrated by pitch framing, stealing pitches, so to speak, stealing, maybe you steal a little kiss in the locker room, maybe you steal a relationship. And then, I mean, so you start with this non-linear narrative construction where we are moving back and forth from the present action in spring training or the present action at the All-Star Classic, and then flashing back to the spring training 3 seasons prior. I'm so curious, like from a narrative perspective, how did you choose the points at which you flash forward and flash back?
So I and you know, I read Clubbie. I really like Clubbie, by the way. So I'll be honest, I like setting myself up to do really hard things. Before I wrote this book, I had never written a book that had chapter breaks in it.
Hmm.
And so like when those inflection points were supposed to come was like a pretty big learning process. I had written actually a previous book, a previous novel that ended up trunked, but like was written you start on page 1 and you end up on page 278
Right.
with no chapters. Which sounds absurd now that you say it out loud, or I say it out loud. So in terms of the non-linear narrative, I had never written anything with a non-linear narrative. It is a narrative I like reading, and I think that that's maybe the reason I decided to do that. Some of it goes back to that recontextualization of like I wanted to have the past and the present in the narratives be in conversation with one another. And so there are some specific parallels between like something will happen in the past and something similar will happen in the present, sort of fairly intentionally. Um, and the kind of reasoning behind that was, do you know, are you familiar with Rhea Butcher, the comedian?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so they did a podcast for a long time. They're a big baseball fan and did a podcast called Three Swings. It's a great podcast. I think it's sunset now, but you can go back and listen to old episodes. And at one point they said baseball is a game that's always in conversation with its own history. That every game that you go to, you are experiencing all the games that have come before it at the same time. And that was something that I think I was listening to it while I was walking to work one day and I'm like, oh, that just like got me, right? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
That's
like,
so true. Like every choice means so much in the game.
and just like, you know, there's enough space within the game that if you're experiencing something on the field, you know, if you see a left fielder make a great catch, right? Josh Bell robbed somebody of a home run the other day. You're going to immediately think of, when have I seen other left fielders do something like that? You know, when was that? What circumstances? How was I feeling? Who was I with? And so I wanted to have that sort of feeling of the past and the present are in conversation with each other. I got the paw on the shoulder of "you're being too loud." But that was sort of the reasoning behind that. For deciding when to switch, it was sort of like, well, we've sort of run into where you have to go to the past or the present in order to further the narrative of the other one.
Right. It makes sense. Like there are those moments at the All-Star Classic that you wouldn't feel the tension between Zach and Eugenio if you didn't have the history of what was that spring training like 3 years ago when they were falling in love, and otherwise it would fall flat if it weren't for that context. So I get it.
Yeah, to pick on an example, I was at the clinch game when the Nats clinched going to the postseason 2 years ago. And like a little forgotten moment of that is Hunter Strickland came out to pitch against Bryce Harper. And like that's a big moment of tension because you know their history. Like you know that there was a big brawl and like they have this like long history of just being two jerks who are like jerks at each other. But like again, it's sort of that's how baseball is. Like you have to bring that narrative and that narrative sense to every sort of play. And I kind of wanted to have a book that felt like that.
So where does Unwritten Rules fit within the romance genre? Especially sports romance is a pretty prominent genre as well. Where does it fit in there as far as following the same aesthetic choices and all of that? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for people who are not familiar with romance as a genre, it is defined as has to have a central love story, has to have a happily ever after. So the main couple has to be together and alive at the end of it. So Romeo and Juliet, not a romance. It's a love story, but it's not a romance. I think the example I gave the other day is She's All That is a romance. Central love story, couples together at the end. Nicholas Sparks, if folks read Nicholas Sparks, not usually a romance, considers himself a writer of love stories because there's a lot of people die at the end. So within that, the book fits the characteristics and definition of the genre. But within that genre, there's a lot of different like subgenres. So contemporary sports romance is one. There's actually historical sports romance. There's paranormal sports romance. There's just like a whole variety of that. I would say the book is slightly like a toe closer to regular commercial fiction than a lot of romance, but I would say just like a toe. So it fits pretty kind of categorically within it. I did want to know, so like, have you read romance novels before? Or was this like the first one?
This is the first one that I've really gotten deep into. I mean, I've read pages or short versions of romance novels. So this is the first one that I was actually fully in.
Okay. So I would say if you were to go to the store and, you know, grab romances off the shelf kind of at random, you'd get a variety of different like narrative styles. You get a variety of different ways to do it. What's kind of on trend right now are contemporary romances that are a little bit more rom-com-y, that have usually dual points of view in the protagonists, and that are usually told either in first person present or third person past. So if you were to sort of go and grab one at random, if you had a replacement level romance novel, that's what it would probably be. I obviously don't do any of that. Well, because I like to make my life difficult for myself.
Right. You like to make difficult choice. You like to put yourself in difficult circumstances and see if you can work your way out of it.
Yeah, you know, it's just why not start in the hole. You know, I would say again, the reason it's a toe towards more commercial fiction is it's single point of view, it's third person, present tense. It's a little bit literary-ish is maybe a bad term. It's maybe a little bit oh, I have a degree in fiction writing, so I have damage from that. That's why.
Gotcha. I know that vibe. Trust me, I've been there too.
I'm like, you know, I have a specific professor who I'm like, I hope you're rolling in your grave because you told me I'd never be published. I'm like, this one's for you, buddy.
For real.
No, so I've read a lot of literary fiction. I like literary fiction. I think that this is different from literary fiction in significant ways. But in terms of like language use and stuff like that, it's a little bit more on the literary end of commercial.
For sure, especially if you're starting off with a pretty deeply entrenched metaphor of pitch framing throughout the first part of the book. I mean, that is a literary type extended metaphor.
Somebody wrote in a review that they didn't expect to find pitch framing sexy. I'm like, I've done my job. All right, I'm good. Just put that as the blurb on the cover. I'll just walk it off for the rest of the day. But yeah, so I would say like if folks are really if people are considering getting into romance as a genre, I would suggest thinking about like, what do you like? And there is a romance out there that you would like. So if you read a lot of high second world fantasy, there is high second world fantasy romance. If you read a lot of like pulpy 1880s in the US type like detective fiction, which I'm picking on myself because I like that, there is romance for that. You can get the romance version of that. So like whatever someone told me, they were like, I really like intergenerational family stories set in cities. I'm like, oh boy, do I have romance for you. Like whatever you like, you can get the romance equivalent of it.
So with you, okay, you told me that you're writing another baseball focused
Yeah.
book using a fictionalized version of a Baltimore baseball team. I see the
Yes.
Nat, you've made the Nats reference. You have the Nats on the back there. So why your love of baseball and romance? How did those two things come together?
So, you know, the main advice in terms of, like I said, I have a degree in fiction writing. I also have a degree in other things that actually feed me, and like pay my mortgage. So, you know, I've always been into fiction writing. The best advice for writers is always you read in the genre that you like want to write in, and you write in the genre you enjoy reading in, and it's a genre I enjoy reading in. I didn't become, I would say, a hardcore romance reader until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, which is later in life for romance readers, not like my life. But a lot of people like picked it up from like their primarily like a parent's paperbacks, like the old 80s, like it's called the clinch cover. You're sort of envisioning it, and then you open it and there's like the bigger painting inside. Are you familiar with this at all?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like the cover it sections off like an oval of the actual cover, and then you open up and it's the full picture on the page, right?
Yeah, so it's called a step back. I
Step
just,
back.
you know, step back. Yeah. I again, that's a specific term, but like people are envisioning like the clinch cover where it's pretty sexy, and then like you open it and there's like this big painting. So like people kind of mostly come into romance from having relatives, or family members, or friends or whoever who read those in the 80s or 90s and kind of picked them up. And I just didn't come in through that avenue. So the books I'm most likely to pick up in like my parents' house, I'm like, this is a very sad book. Like this is going to be like on like the women's fiction side, or like this is a history of tuberculosis, and I'm like, this is not
Right.
not what I want to read.
So then how did you come into it?
You know, I kind of picked on, there's a specific writer who writes like literally like pulp fiction but make it romance.
Mhm.
And it was like, I really enjoyed that. You know, I grew up on like detective stories and like old radio plays about detectives and stuff like that. And so that was my entry point of like, let me read about like detectives and spies in the 1880s, but make it romance. And then I got into it. And then for baseball, you know, when I said I like to make my life harder for myself, well, I'm a Nationals fan.
Mhm.
Uh, so obviously I couldn't have watched them before 2005. And you can't really have watched them before 2006 because they weren't telecast their first year of existence.
Jesus. I didn't
Yeah,
know that.
and you didn't want to go to RFK Stadium anyway. It had historically terrible sight lines and was just kind of gross. Not in like the Coliseum, it's charming kind of way, it was just kind of gross. I went to a lot of concerts there when I was a teenager, and it was yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say I didn't become a serious Nats fan until like there was like a glimmer of hope for the franchise
Right.
in like 2010, 2011, because like before then was pretty dire. But like, how do I put this? My sister has a hat signed by Ryan Church, like that level of Nationals fandom. Like we routinely talk about Niger Morgan.
Gotcha. And yet
Routinely.
you put Zach and Eugenio eventually goes to, I'm saying it, not you, so it's not copyright infringement. He eventually goes to a New York Yankees, a fictionalized version of the New York Yankees.
Yeah, so they end up in New York. Eugenio playing for the New York Gothams.
The
Who, if
Mets
you
and the Yankees, yeah.
look up the logo, though the Gothams technically became the Giants. It's an alternative universe where the Gothams never moved out of New York. The Giants never moved out of New York. And then yes, he ends up in New York. And then the book is set in primarily in Oakland and in Miami.
So I'm curious, as a Nats fan, why didn't you put them on a Washington Nationals proxy team?
Yeah, I wanted a little bit somewhat the discussions about the Coliseum, which is definitely not the Oakland. It's not
definitely not
the Oco Coliseum. It is the Elephants Coliseum, which is a different building. And so some of it was about the Colosseum, some of it was about some of the organizational practices that kind of emblematically go on in teams that really buy into analytics hardcore. So this is probably the only romance that really gets into issues of service time manipulation.
Right.
And so I wanted kind of that to have that as a little bit of Easter egg for hardcore baseball fans who are also romance readers, of which there are many.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was why I made that decision. So I wanted the stadiums and sort of the teams to be a little bit analogy laden, heavy, and frankly, there's not a lot of romance in the Washington National Stadium.
Yes, that makes sense.
It's fine. It's a perfectly fine replacement stadium, but like you're not writing essays about the Washington National about Nats Park. Like you're like there's pretty decent food and like the parking's fairly convenient.
Yeah, it's a very template stadium. It's a very template stadium to go to. You have the shipping container bars there, right? That's the only personality I can really remember about that ballpark.
It's very nice to watch a game in,
Mhm.
but is like uh, for the Coliseum, I actually quote semi verbatim from a baseball prospectus essay about the Oakland Coliseum. And like again, that was a really so that was Clarissa Young wrote that essay a couple years ago about the Coliseum. And so again, I wanted to kind of pull from something that just had a little bit more personality,
Mhm.
and a little bit more, I don't know, literary device. And
Right.
Nats Park has shipping containers and some fairly decent tater tots.
So as far as the sports romance genre goes, like who are your idols in the genre?
Yeah. So I would say the author who really got me into reading romance is an author named KJ Charles, who again writes primarily historical, sort of queer historical romance that is very pulpy, but like well paced, well plotted, still big love stories, but also there's always a really interesting I wouldn't even say B plot. It's sort of a 1A, 1A, 1B plot, or A1, A2 plot. There we go. Of you have your romance, but you also have like some kind of intrigue. So there's an author, actually, I share an agent with her, named Rachel Reed, who writes a bunch of hockey romances that are really, really popular, that are really great. Um, Gosh, who else? What am I currently reading? It's easier to just be like, what am I currently reading? Because
Yeah.
everything I'm currently reading is better. So I'm reading right now a book called For the Love of April French, which is about is by an author who is also a Carina Press author, who is a trans woman who lives in Austin, Texas, and is about a love story set around a BDSM club in Austin, Texas, and is like has some really like cool structural elements. I've told Penny, who's the author of this, but is like structured in some really cool ways in terms of like perspective and point of view. In
How do you
addition
mean?
to being, so again, usually like alternate POVs, like person one, person two, person one, person two, and it sort of moves through linear time. The way that Penny structured it was the first section of the book does that. So it's April, and then Dennis, who's the love interest, and it's sort of alternating. And then the larger sections of the book is 6 months from April's perspective, and then it goes back and it's the same 6 months from Dennis's perspective.
Hmm.
And then it starts towards the end as they're kind of coming together, their points of view literally start to come together. It's neat. Like it's a neat way to structure it. Again, I think that's probably not what people think of when they think of it, romance novels, is doing
Right.
kind of like weird, I would call it weird, like interesting or experimental stuff. But that one is really great. I just finished a book by a friend, an author named Sky Killian, who wrote, again, I don't know why I'm saying all things set in Austin, Texas. Are you in Austin or
I am.
no?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Well, great. If you're interested in romances set in Austin, Texas. So this one is set in Austin. It is a woman who just gets out of prison. And when she was in prison, she has like really bad migraines, and she like had a crush on slash like we can't be together with the nurse in the prison. So she gets out, she goes to a clinic to get like her migraine meds, and like runs back into this nurse, and they again fall in love. And it's just a lovely little love story set in Austin, but really about like how do you read to great into society after being in prison, and like what are all of these like barriers that have occurred because she was in prison. Yeah, so
it almost
those,
just as a neophyte here, and you talk about the genre, it almost seems like, I'm going to throw a harebrained hypothesis out there, but it seems like the really hard line tropes of the genre that are like, it needs to be about a couple, it needs to have a happily ever after, they have to both be alive. It seems like those rules almost make it easier to experiment in other ways in the genre.
so one of the things that people have said a lot, particularly in the past years about reading romance, is that there's a feeling of safety, right? You know that this couple is going to, you know that the story, they're going to end up together, no one's going to die. Generally a lot of times the ending is also optimistic. So like it's not only that they're together and alive, but that they've accomplished whatever goals they need to accomplish. If there is an antagonist, that antagonist has not accomplished their goals. But really beyond that, anything goes. And so once you sort of have that as a destination, you're right, you can be pretty highly experimental. And so I don't know, people kind of come in, I think, with the idea that formula means that you can't be experimental. But I think formula actually opens up a lot of possibility.
Because otherwise there's too many options with fiction. It's overwhelming. Having that formula just makes it easier.
Yeah, and like I said, I write with like, do you know what beat sheets are?
No, please tell me.
Okay, so like in romance, you can actually like download a spreadsheet that says the first X percentage of the book should probably accomplish this. The next X percentage. And there's beat sheets for mystery. So I would say mystery, like you wouldn't read a murder mystery where you don't find out who did it at the end, right?
Right.
Like that's not satisfying, or that would tip it into like literary fiction about like the futility of blah 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 whatever. And so you wouldn't do it. I wouldn't watch an episode of Columbo that didn't start with like, this is who did the murder, and by the end you know Columbo's going to have solved it, but anything between then is totally up to the writers. And so I do use beat sheets for that, because you know you can look at it and say like in about the first 20%, the main couple or however many people should have met. They should have a reason to spend time together, and they should have like fundamental misbeliefs that they're carrying with them that actually keep them apart.
I'm gonna start downloading. I wrote that down, a beat sheet. I got to look that up for every genre. I mean, can you find it for any genre?
That I can't tell you. I know that they exist for mystery and romance. It's possible for memoir, or other sort of, for other literary fiction there are. But I'm most familiar with them for romance. You should just check out a romance one. Like they're really interesting, because you're thinking like, again, by 20%, these people should have met.
Right.
But and they should like have a reason to like spend some time, but that fundamental misbelief shouldn't be dealt with until about 70% of the way through the book. So they are going to carry with them from the beginning of the book to 70% some fundamental lie about themselves or the way that the world works that they believe to be 100% true, and they will have to be disillusioned with and to reject in order to find like whatever happiness is for them.
Why is Harlequin so synonymous with this genre?
They're big. It's a big publisher. So there's Big Five. They've been publishing romance for a long time. There was some consolidation of imprints and stuff in the, I would want to say, early to mid 80s. I'm not super familiar with the history. I do want to be clear for listeners. Romance is probably the not majority, but it's definitely the plurality of fiction sold in the US, and it's a more than billion-dollar industry. So like people are like, well, why romance? I'm like, well, I enjoy reading it, like first and foremost, but like there's readers there.
Oh yeah. I mean, if I see people talking on like Facebook author groups, the people
Yeah.
who bring in the most money are the people who are writing romance novels. There's a huge readership. And if you get readers, they seem to just stick with you for your whole career.
So there's a huge readership. There's also, I would say, a sense of community among authors, because these are readers who will read 200 to 300 books a year.
Wow.
Yeah. So I cannot write 200 to 300 books a year. So I better support the people next to me and the community, because we are providing a service that none of us individually could do.
That's not an exaggeration. 200 to 300 books a year.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes we're talking more than that.
Wow.
Yeah. So not everybody. There are folks who read 5 books a year. Yeah. First you read 1 book a year. If you're going to read 1 book a year, Unwritten Rules, it's from Carina Press. But these are folks who are voracious readers. They are very thoughtful readers, but I mean, just by volume, right? 200 to 300 books a year doesn't mean that those books are disposable. It doesn't mean that those books are like easy, because I think I just described a whole bunch of books that are not like what you think of as fundamentally easy books. But there's no way one author, even a handful, could fulfill that.
Right. So there's just this really voracious desire from this readership that they just want new content all the time.
Yeah. And so when you see all of this stuff about author groups, etc., like there is a lot of money to be made in it, but it's also like you can't serve this with that in the absence of other writers.
Right.
And I will mention, book is fairly flexible. So anything from about 25,000 words to 110,000 words is considered a book. So if that helps with the 200 to 300 number, a lot of those books that Harlequin puts out are about 50 to 60,000 words.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Still, it's a lot of reading.
It's a lot of reading.
But before we close out, I want to be respectful of your time here. I just want to ask you one last thing about, so Carina is an imprint of Harlequin. This is your debut novel with that press. What is there a specific meaning behind publishing with this this imprint and this publisher that is synonymous with the genre that you're publishing in? What does that mean to you?
So what I will say is, it's a queer sports romance in traditional publishing. As of right now, traditional publishing is really getting more and more into queer romance, but for a long time that was not really the what traditional publishing did. So there were a lot of small presses, indie presses. There's a huge number of people who self-publish in romance as well, because there was sort of this readership who wanted these books, and then traditional publishing wasn't super into providing those. And even if you go to a bookstore, the chances of finding a queer high heat romance novel on the shelves are actually fairly low. However, Carina has been doing it for about more than 10 years, is what I'll say. So it was an imprint that started, it's a digital first imprint, though there are some paperbacks that they put out that you can find in bookstores, but they've been doing that for a long time. So, for me, I wanted to work with a traditional publisher, but who had a lot of experience kind of in this particular subgenre, and a lot of like institutional support for kind of publishing these kinds of stories. And I appreciate that Harlequin was like, hey, there's readers and there's money and there's an audience for this, but they got into it a lot earlier than I would say other traditional publishers who are still kind of figuring out what it means to them. And that's not a bad thing. I'm glad that they're doing it, but it's just that Korea's been doing it a little bit longer.
Right. And where can the people find the book, and when does it come out?
Sure. So the book comes out October 12th, so a few short weeks. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on any really e-retailer. You can go to the Carina Karina website, the Karina Press website, and it will have all of the links. And you can find me everywhere on social media at Instagram, Twitter, Facebook sometimes, and at my website at katiecasey.com, or Katie Casey Writes is my handle across those places. So come hang out, talk about baseball, maybe learn a little something about romance. And if you want to get into romance and aren't sure where to start, we're happy to provide lots and lots of recommendations.
Absolutely. And if you're looking for a gay sports romance with high heat levels, you're starting with Unwritten Rules. Take it from a neophyte in the genre. I got sucked in immediately. Zach is he's a complicated guy. And we get really deep into his mind and the challenges that he faces and the choices that he makes. Eugenio seems smoother in a lot of ways. Zach has a lot more rough edges of, am I going to be out? Are we going to be found out? Is this something we have to keep secret? All of this, it all plays together fascinating way. Katie Casey, thank you so much for joining us on the Pandemic Baseball Book Club author interview series.
Thank you. It was really great chatting with you. So thank you for having me.